Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Kent Swig.
Thank you. No architect sets out to create a poorly designed building, and no developer wants to build one. Yet our cities tend to be filled with projects where good design seems like an afterthought. And good design doesn't necessarily cost more. It just takes a little bit more time and a little bit more care. MAS is committed to the position that well-designed spaces of the highest caliber are essential to the success and the quality of life in our global cities. Our next panel will discuss the need to bring conversations about design to the forefront of development, investment, and the approvals process. Here to lead our conversation on the value of putting design first, please welcome our moderator, Faith Rose, who is Executive Director of Public Design Commission of the City of New York. Thank you.
So we've got 20 minutes to discuss a vast topic that spans many scales, crosses many disciplines, and is integrally tied to economics and policy. So I'm going to jump right in and ask the first question, which is addressed to each of you. What drives you each to put design first?
Anybody want to go first?
I think you should, John.
Okay. Well, I think that, design for us, it's kind of a way of life, putting design first into all of our projects, whether big or small, as we were talking about earlier, is really the critical factor. And the thing is finding the balance. What we always struggle with and work with is, what is that balance? How much design? What does it mean, to put design first? Is it a planning issue? Is it an aesthetic issue? Is it materiality, structure? So all of that is really kind of fitting into what we do. And as I said, it's really something that when you walk in the door in the morning into the office, it's something that you're going to be dealing with all day and questioning.
Ziel?
Every developer is a frustrated architect, so design is very critical. Obviously, in marketing apartments, and our business is primarily luxury condos, design is critical both on layouts and also on curb appeal and appearance of a building. The trick is, of course, not to have architecture dictate your usability of what you're trying to sell. So it's always a push and pull with an architect and ourselves as to a beautifully designed building, maybe with curves or other architectural significant features, can certainly handicap the kind of living experience one has within. So and by the way, design is also subjective. So what one person finds marketable and attractive, somebody else finds less attractive.
I don't think we think in terms of design first. I think we're always trying to synthesize, design and value. New York is a city that's got significant aspiration. It's got opportunity for aspirational pricing. But the solutions for projects in New York are very different than the solutions you would find outside New York, where you're really often creating just a commodity. So I don't think you can really separate design, from either a physical or an economic context. New York, I think, happens to be a place that has more assets than any other city where good design makes sense.
Yeah, I would say that design is critical from our perspective, so much so that DDG, Design Development Group, design is in our name. And so we go to great lengths we look at real estate like an object. And like any good object, there's emotions involved, there's experiential nature to it. And so we think that the design is critical and at the core of any real estate project. That said, every project has site constraints, every project has budget constraints, and there is a push-pull, as Ziel said, between the budget and the design to really end up in a place where the design, the budget, the location, everything marries together. But without good design, you end up with a marginalized product.
So Ziel, can you talk a little bit about how good design is better business for you?
Better business is better business. The market's good, business is good. Well, you know, New York, one of the attractions, and we've touched upon it already briefly, is a very design, fashion, sophisticated consumer. And in real estate, depending on what product that you have that you're trying to sell, it's very critical that the purchasers are perceiving that they're in some, you know, there is egos involved, there is brag appeal involved, there is today when you're dealing with a luxury prospective buyer, bragging rights are sometimes as important as feasibility. So for us, you know, the concept of a starchitect is a word that's being used very broadly, but generally design with a healthy habitability is a great combination.
So Tommy, given the decrease in available federal and state funding, we're seeing the city create more public-private partnerships in order to address city needs. How does this change the development scene in New York?
You know, we develop both commercial and residential projects. You know, an honest and hard examination of the commercial market would underscore the fact that a significant amount of the new commercial space requires a form of subsidy. Certainly there's a subsidy at Hudson Yards, subsidy involved at World Trade Center, and so it's interesting. Our sense of New York is there's significantly more population growth than reliable job growth. So I think it's more likely to impact the commercial sector. In terms of the residential sector, we clearly are undersupplied in terms of housing. And to kind of grab your question and expand it a little bit, you know, if the topic of this panel, what makes, you know, good design and how does good design first? You know, one way that we will need to think about going forward to provide good design for housing with good, you know, local and federal policy is we need to avoid the kind of regulations that existed really in the 60s and 70s, you know, that produced some of the design that we're least proud of in New York. Part of the reason for that is rent regulation. So good design, you know, ultimately comes at a premium. It's never a first choice in economic terms. It comes at a premium, particularly in a place like New York, to the existing supply. And if New York ultimately wants to create good design, I think it's dependent on economic growth, and for that it needs policies to support it.
So John, time and certainty are crucial factors in a development's success. How does good design relate to that?
Well, it's because time is money, and that's an important part of the budget for a project. It's very critical that the process allows for, you know, discussion, for input, you know, from the various stakeholders, from the community, from the development side, from the marketing side. But all of that really has to come together, you know, in some kind of time, in a time frame which allows for, you know, for the profitability of the project. I think what Tommy's saying is true, that there's, you know, that has to be factored in, and the certainty is really a critical part of it. Now, the beauty that we have in New York City is that we have a zoning resolution which, for all of its faults, it is a document with a lot of certainty. And you can take that document, and what you need to do is you need to know how to manipulate it, how to use it properly, how to get things out of it that might not be so obvious, because there are the obvious things. You know, certain buildings go like this. That's obvious. Some of them can go this way, and that's less obvious, but it still fits within those rules. When it fits within the rules, that eliminates an incredible amount of time. We're having to go back to the City Planning Commission or other agencies to figure out how to do that. So I think that this is a document where the City Planning Commission should continue to put their efforts in refining it, because I believe that it is such an important tool for certainty in development.
So Joe, the current American economy is very urban friendly. It's driven by media, tourism, higher education, and other urban-centric economies. So with that comes higher expectations for the urban quality of life. How does your work, with its focus on good design, help to address this and sort of build a better city, both economically and physically?
I think if I talk to the work that we specifically do here in New York and San Francisco, I think again, design is critical, and the way you meet the street is critical. The interaction that passerby has, a resident has, whether it's commercial, residential, et cetera, you really want to fit into the context of your environment, and whether it's the neighborhood, whether it's the city. You want to pick quality materials. You want to have design that people respond to, because real estate is emotional, and it is very experiential, and it is an object. And whether you're talking about art, or whether you're talking about fashion, or whether you're standing in a park and you're looking at a beautiful tree, it makes you feel something and evokes some sort of emotion. In order for a project to be successful, in our opinion, you need to achieve that while at the same time having real functionality, real usability, and being able to do it on budget. And so if someone walks into a building, when you stand in the lobby of a building, does it feel good or does it not? And you might not be able to put your finger on exactly what it is that evokes that feeling, but you can feel it. And that's what we try to do with all of our projects. We want whoever is experiencing it to really feel like, wow, this is really nice, or this is really beautiful, and it's an object that's well crafted, well designed, and well built.
Okay, so this is a question for everyone. Given that, so I think there's an argument to be made that today's public is more sophisticated in terms of design than ever before. I think we have some significant product design that we're aware of that has helped with that. But given that there's a more sophisticated design sensibility, given that the city is now looking towards private-public developments that are sort of incentivized economically or incentivized by zoning in return to sort of for civic give-backs, like a park or a cultural center or a library or a school, I feel like there are new things happening. And what do each of you think is the next thing we're going to see on the development front, or the next thing we're going to see in terms of city design?
Well, you asked me that question before, and we were all like, yeah. So, and that's a very big question. What's going to be next? And I feel that one area that really needs a lot of attention is transportation. We need to be thinking about new subway lines. We need to be thinking about how we can expand the network out into parts of Brooklyn, for instance, or the Bronx and Queens, because I think that everybody loves the density of New York. People want to live close to the center for many reasons, social reasons. It's fun, it's exciting. And that's all great. But I think that in order for us to create a city where there's more of an equality, where it's possible for people not to have to spend 2 to 3 hours from the outer parts of the city to get to their places of employment, that we need to be improving those systems. And maybe it's redesigning some of the systems we already have in place, because there's already a great value to that. To having that, but I think that this is a way that the city can change in its most positive light. If we could make it more accessible for everyone, to move around, I think this is a really critical factor, which will then also open up neighborhoods for more development, so we could create more housing in areas where there is less of an expense for the value of the properties, and there can be density. And that, I think, will require also talking to communities earlier on in the process and not, because I think our current process where, we use ULURP, we use BSA for some of these larger projects, that process I would characterize as top-down. By the time a developer identifies a piece of property and decides that they want to go into that neighborhood, they've already made an investment, they've already started the clock, their development clock going, and they need to move quickly and efficiently. It would be much better if that in conjunction with planning in those areas, if the city would be out there preparing communities for change that I think has to come.
That's interesting. I'd give a couple of comments. One, we're involved in a project at 1 Vanderbilt with SL Green. And in some ways, I think that's a bit of a window into the future. For so long in New York in Midtown, for a commercial building, it's almost sacred that the FAR is 21.6. But to reinforce what John said, I think going forward, it's going to become clearer and clearer that transportation is one of the real constraints on growth. And therefore, the city is going to, I think, begin to appreciate they're going to have to take a different approach to density. It's really almost based on transportation nodes. So that's one thing that's, I would see as logical and obvious. There, of course, the FAR went from 21.6 to 30 with very significant off-site transit improvements that were also linked to satisfying higher standards of design. Second thing I would say is next, and I'm excited by it, and it's been a topic throughout the day. It seems clear and clear to me that outside Manhattan, for all product types, there's an opportunity for better design. I'm on the board at Phipps, and I think one of the best projects that has been built in New York in the last few years is Via Verde up in the Bronx. It's a wonderful project. It's done at $300,000, $350,000 a unit. Doesn't require expense. It required an intentional approach to transform a neighborhood through good design. And that's how some of those places ultimately will be transformed for all the reasons you said. And that is, I think good design is something valued, both at a civic level and I think at a more populist level. People want to see it, they react to it.
Well, I think from a transportation perspective, I'm not sure other than continuing our subway system, which is, believe it or not, among the best in the world, and some of the lines that come to the different locations. I don't see Robert Moses again sticking out his head and creating highways circulating the city. It's just not practical and doesn't work that way geographically. We have a small landmass with a major population which continues to grow and continues to get service from a transportation perspective. To me, it's always been about open air and light. People gravitate to Brooklyn because Brooklyn tends to have more open air and light. Manhattan is more of a grid. So you look at cities like London, which have very low zoning tolerance for height, and those cities cannot have affordable housing, much worse than us, and can't even expand because there's no place to expand. The mayor's current position on affordable housing, which allows the developer to create more density and greater height, if in fact that can work in practice, I think is a very good step forward, because ultimately buildings that rise higher and are required to create parks. We have two circumstances. We're doing a project with a church on 29th and 5th where we're building high, but we're opening up a big park that didn't exist there before. And on the High Line, a park that the city negotiated under the previous owner, again, creating this ability of quality of life, which for me, if you're living in an urban environment, remember there's an urbanization of America going on where people are leaving the suburbs to come to big cities. And the reason they come into big cities, aside from the fact that they're safer and more culturally diverse, is their offerings of parks and open air. So the continuing policy of allowing height, I know it casts shadows on Central Park, and I know there are different arguments against it, but the reality is if you have to fit affordable housing, for instance, if you want to build 400 units of affordable housing, just by way of example, to fit it into a 20-story building will allow you to have much more open air than if you had to fit it into a 6-story building that creates a lot more floor area that's being used up. So I think we're on the right path, frankly. the tug against that is the community boards and all. There's always a position that don't want to see additional height, but I think it's rather short-sighted.
I think that the urbanization of the country, frankly, is a great thing from a resource perspective, great from an environmental perspective. You have a concentration of individuals, people, as opposed to all spread out. You're not using as many cars. You look at the carbon footprint; it's much better. The critical components of that, I think, are three-pronged. It is transportation, because you need a great transportation network in order for urbanization to work. Density, you have to increase the density around that transportation network in order to continue the urbanization and not have urban sprawl, and the green space. So I think those green space, open space, whether it's public park, whether it's indoor plazas, those three, I think, really have to go hand in hand in order for long-term urbanization to be successful.
Thank you very much. I think we solved a lot of the world's problems today in 20 minutes.